Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me today. This is video number 3 in an 8-part series on the Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment. And in today's video, I'm actually going to talk about absolutism and begin talking about England as an example where leaders at least attempted to rule with absolute power, but we see quite a transition, which I think will make transitioning into talking about the Enlightenment more effective and easier to understand where Enlightenment ideas were coming from, why people were seeking something different. So it's important to know what the different thing was that they were seeking. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so first, just want to speak very briefly to what absolutism is as far as that concept goes. All right, so one of the things that you see happening in, we'll just focus on Europe at this point in time, is you saw as countries were developing that rulers, so think people like kings, were wanting to have more and more power. And so one of the terms that comes about at this time is people who served in the role of absolute monarch. So basically, think of a king with total power. Think of a king who gets to just unilaterally make whatever decisions need to be made for their country, the place and the people that they're in power over. Now that can be a perfectly good thing if you have a leader that has the interests of the country and the people of the country in mind. They may be able to exercise that absolute power in a way that's beneficial to everyone. Unfortunately, sometimes when you have someone who has all of the power and the authority, they don't necessarily make the wisest decisions and end up making decisions that may be beneficial to themselves personally, but at the expense of the country and at the expense of the people in the country. So it's maybe a bit of a double-edged sword when someone has a lot of power and authority. Now, one of the rationalizations for many of the people who tried to rule with absolute power and absolute authority is by making some kind of divine right claim and with divine right in this context, what we're talking about is the idea that God made the monarch or God made the king, and as a result, the king only had to answer to God. So you can imagine that if you had somebody in a position of power like a king who truly believed in this divine right principle, that it wouldn't faze them in the least to operate completely with their own decision making without consulting with anybody or without even necessarily caring what anybody around them thought about the decisions they were making. If you thought you only had to answer to God and you thought you were doing what was right in God's eyes, it would give you a great opportunity to just do whatever you wanted. So that's a little bit about this concept of absolutism. And so what we're going to look at today and over the next couple of videos will be how this played out in England. All right, so with England, our starting point in talking about absolutism and the transition to something away from that to be more consistent with what enlightened thinkers would want to see with government, we'll start with Elizabeth I. I've got the time reference up there for when she was Queen of England and sole leader for England, 1558 to 1603, so the back half of the 1500s. One of the big things, among many things, that took place while she was in power was getting the Protestant Anglican Church really going in England. That was a way of trying to kind of bridge the divide between what had been the Catholic Church in England to moving away and having a king or a queen actually get to be in charge of the church. And so one of the goals she had with her leadership was to create a church that both Protestants and Catholics could live with. Now, as you can maybe imagine, in an area like religion, whatever it is you do is probably going to please some people and upset others. And especially when you look to do some kind of a compromise, it shouldn't be too surprising that you might end up not pleasing anybody. So she certainly had her challenges. And so while she was in power, there were a lot of attempts to overthrow her. And another thing that was a challenge for her was to get the money she needed to do the things she thought needed to happen for England. And one of the things that's a little bit unique with absolutism as a concept with the country of England by this time is that they had a body of people known as Parliament that existed. And one of the big things that Parliament was used for was to consent to releasing funds to pay for whatever it might be, whether it was a war or anything else. And especially when you run through stretches of time where you have a leader that thinks they don't need anybody's consent to do anything, England was an interesting place to see conflict develop. So as far as moving towards real true absolutism in England, I want to speak just a little bit about what came after Elizabeth I died. She had no heirs to the throne, so it was a close family member, a relative, and this is how things worked a lot in the royal families throughout Europe. So the next closest relative was the person who happened to be King of Scotland at the time, a man by the name of James I. So he becomes King of England as well as King of Scotland in 1603. And part of what makes this important is, as King of Scotland, he ruled with absolute authority, was not accustomed to having to work with a body like Parliament or anything like that. And so when he came in as King of England, he expected to be able to rule the same way. And so, as it related to the reality that Parliament was a thing in England, he worked very poorly with them. And as a result, he had trouble getting money to do any of the things that he might have wanted to do. Even though reality for him was the existence of Parliament, he pushed against it time and time again. Now, where this may become particularly important is after his death and the replacement for him by his own son, Charles I. Charles I grew up with his father and saw how his father did things. And as is often the case, he continued doing things essentially the same way his father had. And so he too struggled with Parliament, only he would take things a little bit further in how he, I guess, expressed his displeasure at the struggles with Parliament, as he got into the habit of dissolving it and just saying, all right, you don't exist anymore. Which, if you want to maybe draw a little bit of a comparison, if you think about our country and how things are set up, we have a president, we also have a Congress. They have some different roles to play, but in certain ways they need to work together. And for Charles I to dissolve Parliament would be very much the same as having a president say, all right, Congress, you don't exist anymore. You're gone. I'm just going to take things on my own. And so that was a rough situation, especially for those in England who believed Parliament did have a legitimate role to play in how the country operated. Now, one of the things that would come from this would be something that would be maybe less impactful in the moment and very impactful moving forward. And that was in one of the times when Charles I had told Parliament, you're gone, you don't exist. But then, the reality was he did need them. And so he called them back. Parliament felt that they were in position to get this guy to consent to some things. And so they had him sign what was called the Petition of Right in 1628. And the list up here are the main things from this petition. Basically, one of the things it reflects are things that he was doing as king and that they didn't feel was appropriate. So he couldn't put people in prison without having a specific reason. He could not collect taxes from anyone without Parliament's consent. He could not house soldiers in private people's homes without consent, and he could not impose martial law in peacetime, which basically means military rule when there wasn't actually a war going on. So one thing to note, those were all things that were taking place, otherwise they wouldn't have mentioned them. And as far as Charles was concerned, he went ahead and signed the document. I think it becomes quite apparent that he didn't really believe in the document, but he did sign the document. And so at least moving forward, there was, at least on paper, an acknowledgement by a king that there were some limits on his power. Now, what we do see with Charles moving forward is, despite having signed this document that acknowledged that, if nothing else, when it came to trying to raise money, he accepted that he would have to work with Parliament. He would dissolve Parliament yet again. So as far as raising money, one of the things he did that not surprisingly made him even less popular than ever was he began doing things like fining people to raise money. And again, as a result, he became extremely unpopular. And as we get to the next video, we'll talk about really the transition phase where in England they go from having kings fighting to be absolute monarchs to transitioning more towards a system that would ultimately start incorporating ideas that would be consistent with Enlightenment thought. So for now, we'll go ahead and sign off and call this good. Thanks for joining me with today's video. I hope you found it informative, and I hope you'll tune in for the next video where we'll talk about the English Civil War and what came as a result of it. Thanks for watching.